December 27, 1979. Tajbeg Palace, Kabul, Afghanistan. 7:15 p.m. Colonel Grigory Boyarinov of the KGB's Alpha Group crouched behind a concrete barrier as automatic weapons fire ripped through the palace corridors. Around him, Spetsnaz operators moved through the smoke-filled halls of Afghan President Hafizullah Amin's residence. The mission was simple: eliminate Amin, install a more reliable Soviet ally, and secure Afghanistan's socialist revolution. It should have been over in hours. The palace walls shook with explosions. Boyarinov could hear his men shouting coordinates in Russian, the crack of AK-74s, the distinctive thump of RPG rounds. Outside, Soviet paratroopers from the 105th Guards Airborne Division were already securing Kabul's airport and key government buildings. 300 T-62 tanks had crossed the border from Uzbekistan. Nearly 80,000 Soviet troops were pouring into Afghanistan through the Salang Pass and by air transport. Moscow had assured the Politburo this would be a brief operation, 6 months, perhaps a year. A limited intervention to stabilize a fraternal socialist state on the USSR's southern border. Soviet military planners, studying their maps in the warmth of Moscow's winter, saw a landlocked nation of 15 million largely illiterate people armed with outdated rifles. What they didn't see, couldn't see, was that they were walking into a graveyard of empires. By 10:30 p.m., Amin was dead. The palace was secured. Moscow's preferred replacement, Babrak Karmal, was already being flown in from exile. Colonel Boyarinov himself lay dead in the palace courtyard, one of the first Soviet casualties. Within weeks, the Soviet army would control every major city in Afghanistan. Within months, they would control almost nothing beyond those cities. And within a decade, the invasion would help destroy the Soviet Union itself. The Soviet leadership entered Afghanistan with supreme confidence, born from decades of Cold War success. Since 1945, the USSR had projected power across Eastern Europe, supported socialist movements from Cuba to Angola, and matched America's nuclear arsenal warhead for warhead. Afghanistan, a Soviet neighbor where Moscow had cultivated influence since the 1950s, seemed like the easiest intervention yet. The whole thing will be over in 3 to 4 weeks, Marshal Sergei Sokolov told his staff officers in December 1979. Soviet intelligence assessments painted Afghanistan as a nation ripe for stabilization. The KGB's Kabul station reported that opposition to the communist government consisted mainly of feudal landlords and Islamic reactionaries, who would scatter once confronted with Soviet military might. General Secretary Leonid Brezhnev, aging and increasingly infirm, saw Afghanistan through the lens of the Brezhnev Doctrine. Once a nation joined the socialist camp, the USSR was obligated to prevent its return to capitalism. "We cannot lose Afghanistan," he told the Politburo in December 1979. The Soviet Union had invested heavily in Afghanistan's infrastructure, roads, schools, military bases. The April 1978 communist coup had brought the People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan, PDPA, to power, making Afghanistan a Soviet satellite. When Afghan President Nur Muhammad Taraki was murdered by his deputy Hafizullah Amin in September 1979, Moscow panicked. Intelligence reports suggested Amin might be a CIA agent. Whether true or not, Soviet leaders believed their southern flank was at risk. Defense Minister Dmitry Ustinov argued forcefully for intervention. "If we don't act, we'll have American bases on our southern border within a year." The Soviet Union shared a 1,500-mile border with Afghanistan. The specter of American missiles, positioned minutes from Soviet Central Asia, haunted the Kremlin's strategic planners. The Americans, still reeling from the fall of Saigon 4 years earlier, initially underestimated the invasion's significance. President Jimmy Carter's national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, saw opportunity where others saw tragedy. "We now have the chance to give the USSR its own Vietnam," he wrote in a confidential memo days after the invasion. The CIA's Islamabad station had already been cultivating relationships with Pakistani intelligence and Afghan resistance groups. What began as a trickle of support, old Enfield rifles and ammunition, would become a torrent. The Afghan resistance, fragmented among tribal, ethnic, and religious lines, initially seemed incapable of coordinated opposition. Soviet military intelligence estimated there were perhaps 15,000 active fighters, poorly armed and trained. "We'll sweep them up in a few months," predicted one GRU report. The mujahideen commanders, men like Ahmad Shah Massoud in the Panjshir Valley and Gulbuddin Hekmatyar in Nangarhar province, were dismissed as bandits in Soviet military briefings. Pakistan's military dictator, General Muhammad Zia-ul-Haq, saw something different. With Soviet troops now positioned just miles from Pakistan's border, he understood the invasion as an existential threat to his nation and an unprecedented opportunity to bleed the communist superpower. "The water in Afghanistan must boil at the right temperature," he told CIA officers, meaning the conflict had to be sustained at a level that would drain Soviet resources without triggering a direct Soviet attack on Pakistan. In Washington, the Carter administration's initial response was cautious. The president authorized $30 million in covert aid to the Afghan resistance in January 1980. A pittance compared to what would come. American intelligence assessments were pessimistic. The Defense Intelligence Agency concluded, "Soviet control of Afghanistan is irreversible. The resistance cannot win." What neither superpower understood yet was that winning and losing in Afghanistan would be measured not in territory captured, but in blood spilled and rubles spent. Afghanistan's journey to Soviet occupation began long before December 1979. The Kingdom of Afghanistan had maintained precarious independence by playing Britain and Russia against each other throughout the 19th century's Great Game. After World War II, Afghanistan turned increasingly toward the Soviet Union for economic and military assistance, not from ideological affinity, but from necessity and geography. Soviet economic aid flowed into Afghanistan beginning in 1956. Moscow built the Salang Tunnel through the Hindu Kush Mountains, paved roads, constructed airports, and trained the Afghan military. By the 1970s, thousands of Afghan officers had received training in Soviet military academies, creating a pro-Soviet faction within Afghanistan's armed forces. Soviet influence seemed permanent. The April 1978 Sour Revolution brought the Communist People's Democratic Party of Afghanistan to power in a bloody coup. President Mohammad Daoud Khan, who had maintained a careful balance between East and West, was killed along with his family. The new communist government, led by Nur Mohammad Taraki and his deputy Hafizullah Amin, immediately began radical reforms: land redistribution, women's education, suppression of Islam. These policies, imposed from Kabul on a conservative tribal society, ignited rebellion across Afghanistan's countryside. By summer 1979, Soviet military advisors were reporting insurgent control of vast swaths of rural Afghanistan. The Afghan army was disintegrating through mass defections. On March 17, 1979, in the city of Herat, Afghan army units mutinied and joined insurgents in killing Soviet advisors and their families. Accounts vary, but somewhere between 100 and 350 Soviet citizens were murdered, some tortured to death. The Herat uprising shocked Moscow. KGB chairman Yuri Andropov advocated caution. In a March 1979 memo to Brezhnev, he wrote, "The deployment of our troops would be seen by the world as aggression and would destroy our policy of détente." Foreign Minister Andrei Gromyko agreed. Everything would immediately change for the worse. The international community would view our actions as naked aggression. But as 1979 progressed, the situation deteriorated. Taraki flew to Moscow in September seeking Soviet military intervention. "If we don't get help," he told Brezhnev, "we'll lose Afghanistan." Days after returning to Kabul, Taraki was murdered by Amin in a palace coup. Soviet intelligence became convinced that Amin was betraying socialism. His independence from Moscow's direction, combined with rumors of contacts with American diplomats, triggered paranoia in the Kremlin. The final decision came in December 1979. Andropov, Ustinov, and Gromyko, the troika running Soviet foreign policy under an increasingly frail Brezhnev, drafted a secret memo recommending invasion. The arguments they presented to the Politburo mixed strategic concern with ideological commitment. American encroachment on the Soviet border, the need to defend socialism, the obligation to prevent the slaughter of Afghan communists. On December 12, 1979, the Politburo voted to invade. Detailed planning had already begun weeks earlier. The 40th Army, based in Central Asia, would lead the invasion. Spetsnaz units would seize key installations in Kabul. The operation received the code name Storm 333, the assault on Tajbeg Palace that would kill Amin and begin the occupation. Soviet forces crossed the border on Christmas Eve 1979, timing the invasion to coincide with Western holidays when international response would be muted. Transport aircraft carrying the 103rd Guards Airborne Division began landing at Kabul's Bagram Air Base on December 25th. By December 27th, when Spetsnaz operators stormed Amin's palace, 50,000 Soviet troops were already in Afghanistan. Within weeks, that number would rise to 80,000. The Soviets installed Babrak Karmal, recalled from exile in Moscow, as Afghanistan's new president. Karmal's first radio address to the Afghan people was broadcast from Soviet Uzbekistan. He wasn't even in Afghanistan yet. It was an inauspicious beginning for a regime that would never establish legitimacy with its own people. The Soviet military entered Afghanistan expecting a police action. What they encountered was a war unlike anything in Soviet military doctrine. The turning point wasn't a single battle, but a cascade of realizations that Afghanistan would destroy everything Moscow thought it knew about modern warfare. Spring 1980. The impossibility becomes clear. By March 1980, Soviet forces controlled every provincial capital, every major city, and every paved road in Afghanistan. They controlled almost nothing else. At night, even in Kabul, Soviet soldiers stayed in their barracks. The Afghan countryside belonged to the mujahideen. Major Valery Vostrotin, commanding a Soviet reconnaissance company in Kunar province, described the problem in his journal. "We can drive through any village in our BMPs. We can shoot anyone we suspect. We can destroy any building. But 10 minutes after we leave, the mujahideen are back. It's like punching water." The Soviet army was organized to fight NATO in Central Europe. Massive tank formations, combined arms operations, nuclear weapons if necessary. In Afghanistan, there were no front lines, no strategic objectives to capture, no decisive battles to win. The mujahideen attacked in small groups, ambushed supply convoys, and melted back into the population or mountain hideouts. Soviet forces responded with overwhelming firepower. But firepower alone couldn't win this war. The first major Soviet operation came in April to May 1980. An offensive into the Kunar Valley intended to destroy mujahideen bases along the Pakistani border. 10,000 Soviet troops, supported by helicopter gunships and artillery, swept through the valley. They killed hundreds of fighters, destroyed dozens of villages, and declared victory. 2 weeks after Soviet forces withdrew, the mujahideen controlled the valley again. The Panjshir offensives, September 1980, August 1985. No engagement better illustrated Soviet frustration than the 9 offensives against the Panjshir Valley, commanded by Ahmad Shah Massoud. The Lion of Panjshir, as Massoud became known, was an ethnic Tajik and Islamic theology student who proved to be a military genius. His 5,000 fighters controlled a strategic valley just 50 miles north of Kabul. The first Panjshir offensive in September 1980 involved 5,000 Soviet troops. They advanced up the narrow valley under constant ambush. Massoud's men destroyed bridges behind the Soviet column, then attacked from the heights. The Soviets lost dozens of armored vehicles and hundreds of men before withdrawing. Over the next 5 years, the Soviets would launch 8 more offensives into the Panjshir, each larger than the last, none successful. Colonel Valery Mironov, who participated in the Third Panjshir offensive, later recalled, "We'd capture the valley floor, every village, every bridge. Then we'd pull back, and within days, Massoud's flag would be flying again. We were fighting ghosts who knew every goat path, every cave. They were fighting for their homeland. We were fighting because Moscow ordered us to." December 1984. The game changer arrives. The true turning point came not from Afghan resistance, but from American intervention. In 1984, after years of limited support, CIA Director William Casey convinced President Ronald Reagan to dramatically escalate American aid to the mujahideen. The CIA's Operation Cyclone, managed through Pakistani intelligence, had grown from $30 million in 1980 to $250 million by 1984. But money alone wasn't enough. The mujahideen needed weapons that could neutralize Soviet air superiority. Soviet Mi-24 Hind helicopter gunships had terrorized Afghan villages since the invasion began. The Hind could deliver troops, provide close air support, and destroy mujahideen positions with rockets and cannon fire. Afghan fighters had only heavy machine guns and RPG-7s to shoot back, rarely effective against armored helicopters. In September 1986, the first FIM-92 Stinger surface-to-air missiles arrived in Afghanistan. The Stinger was a game changer, a shoulder-fired, heat-seeking missile that could bring down aircraft at 11,000 feet. On September 26, 1986, near Jalalabad, Mujahideen commander Ghaffar fired the first Stinger in combat, destroying a Soviet helicopter gunship. Within seconds of launch, the helicopter exploded in a fireball visible for a mile. Mujahideen fighters watching from nearby positions erupted in celebration. Soviet pilot Captain Alexander Rutskoy, who would later become vice president of Russia, described the impact. "Everything changed when the Stingers arrived. We'd been invincible in the air. Suddenly, every flight was a death sentence. Pilots started refusing missions. We had to fly at altitude where we couldn't support ground troops effectively. The psychological impact was devastating. By 1987, the CIA had supplied over 500 Stingers to the Afghan resistance. Soviet and Afghan government aircraft losses skyrocketed. Estimates range from 270 to over 400 aircraft destroyed. Soviet air operations, which had averaged 1,000 sorties per month, dropped by 75%. Without air support, Soviet ground operations became exponentially more dangerous and less effective. The human cost mounts. As the war ground on, the physical and psychological toll on Soviet soldiers became catastrophic. The average Soviet conscript in Afghanistan was 19 years old, poorly trained, and completely unprepared for counterinsurgency warfare. Units suffered from malaria, dysentery, hepatitis, and typhoid. Drug addiction became epidemic. Soviet commanders estimated that 30 to 50% of their troops used hashish regularly. Lieutenant Svetlana Alexievich interviewed hundreds of Afghan war veterans for her book Zinky Boys. One soldier, Vladimir Sychev, described the moral corruption of the war. "We'd go into villages knowing we'd find weapons. We'd find them because we expected to find them. Then we'd destroy the village, kill the men, sometimes kill everyone. I stopped being human somewhere in my second month there. The term Cargo 200 became a dreaded phrase in the Soviet Union, military code for a coffin returning home. Soviet authorities tried to hide casualty figures, but the zinc-lined coffins arriving at airports across the USSR couldn't be hidden. Families weren't allowed to open the sealed caskets. Many suspected their sons' bodies had been so mutilated that identification was impossible, or that the coffins contained body parts from multiple soldiers. By 1985, the war was killing approximately 2,000 Soviet soldiers per year, not counting those who died later from wounds or disease. For a generation of Soviet youth, Afghanistan became a nightmare synonymous with Vietnam for Americans. Soldiers wrote poems about the heights they had to assault. Knowing many wouldn't return, they sang bitter songs about fighting for friendship between peoples, while Afghan civilians spat at them in the streets. As the war dragged into its middle years, both superpowers adapted their strategies with increasing sophistication and brutality. Soviet evolution, from conventional war to scorched earth. Soviet military doctrine evolved through bitter experience. By 1982, the 40th Army had developed specialized tactics for mountain warfare. Heliborne operations became standard. Mi-8 transport helicopters would land troops on mountain peaks, allowing them to assault mujahideen positions from above rather than climbing under fire. Special Forces units, Spetsnaz, took the lead in combat operations, while regular conscripts increasingly performed garrison duty. The Soviets also embraced terror as policy. Mirage operations sent jets to carpet-bomb entire valleys suspected of supporting resistance. Helicopter gunships attacked civilian targets, markets, weddings, irrigation systems. Soviet forces scattered millions of butterfly mines throughout the countryside. Small, plastic explosives designed to maim rather than kill, targeting children who picked them up. The strategy was deliberate. Depopulate the countryside, forcing civilians into government-controlled cities or refugee camps in Pakistan. General Valentin Varenikov, who commanded Soviet forces in Afghanistan from 1984 to 1985, later admitted, "We knew we were creating refugees. That was the point. Take away the water and the fish can't swim. Take away the villages and the mujahideen have nowhere to hide, nobody to feed them." The destruction was systematic and staggering. By 1985, an estimated 5 million Afghans, 1/3 of the country's population, had fled to Pakistan or Iran. Another 2 million were internally displaced. 15,000 villages had been destroyed or damaged. The Soviets laid waste to Afghanistan's irrigation systems, destroyed orchards, and poisoned wells. Ancient agricultural landscapes that had sustained human life for millennia were turned into moonscapes. Soviet forces also attempted to replicate American tactics from Vietnam. They created fortified green zones around major cities, relocated populations to secure villages, and built a network of military bases connected by heavily defended roads. But Afghanistan's terrain, more mountainous than Vietnam, with virtually no jungle, nullified many of these adaptations. American and Pakistani escalation. The CIA's Operation Cyclone became the largest covert operation in agency history, eventually reaching $630 million per year by 1987. Matched dollar for dollar by Saudi Arabia. The operation was managed through Pakistan's Inter Services Intelligence, ISI, which distributed weapons and training to various mujahideen factions. CIA officer Michael Vickers, who designed much of Operation Cyclone's strategy, later explained, "We couldn't send enough weapons to win quickly. That would trigger Soviet escalation or direct intervention in Pakistan. But we could send enough to make Afghanistan a bleeding wound that never healed." That's exactly what we did. The weapons pipeline became increasingly sophisticated. Beyond stingers, the CIA supplied heavy machine guns, mortars, recoilless rifles, satellite intelligence, and sophisticated communications equipment. ISI training camps in Pakistan taught Afghan fighters demolitions, ambush tactics, and mine warfare. Chinese-made rockets gave the mujahideen the ability to shell Soviet bases and airfields from safe distances. Pakistan's General Zia walked a dangerous tightrope. Soviet bombers regularly violated Pakistani airspace, and Soviet intelligence orchestrated terrorist attacks inside Pakistan. The KGB's Kabul station ran hundreds of agents targeting Pakistani officials and mujahideen leaders. Several car bombs in Peshawar, the nerve center of the resistance, killed Pakistani intelligence officers and Afghan commanders. But Zia understood the strategic opportunity. Afghanistan is the soft underbelly of the Soviet Union, he told American officials. Pakistani support for the mujahideen was motivated not just by Cold War alignment with America, but by Pakistan's historical rivalry with India, the Soviet Union's ally. Bleeding the Soviets in Afghanistan kept them too preoccupied to support Indian military ambitions. The mujahideen mature Afghan resistance groups evolved from tribal militias into effective guerrilla armies. 7 major parties based in Peshawar received international recognition and weapons distribution through ISI. The 2 most effective military commanders, Ahmad Shah Massoud in the north and Abdul Haq around Kabul, developed sophisticated tactics, combining traditional Afghan mountain warfare with modern weapons. Massoud built a quasi-government in the Panjshir Valley, complete with schools, clinics, and courts. His 10,000 fighters operated radios captured from Soviet forces, maintained intelligence networks throughout northern Afghanistan, and conducted operations coordinated across multiple provinces. When Soviet forces attacked, Massoud often received advance warning from Afghan army officers sympathetic to the resistance. The mujahideen also developed brutal tactics that terrorized Soviet soldiers. They tortured prisoners, sometimes keeping Soviet captives for years in underground cells. A captured Soviet soldier knew his fate. At best, years of captivity in conditions that would destroy his health. At worst, torture and death. The psychological impact on Soviet troops was profound. Units began refusing to take prisoners. The resistance remained fractured by ethnic, tribal, and ideological divisions. Pashtuns distrusted Tajiks. Islamist radicals clashed with traditional tribal leaders. The CIA's weapons distribution through ISI favored radical Islamic groups like Gulbuddin Hekmatyar's Hezb-e-Islami, despite Hekmatyar spending as much time fighting rival mujahideen factions as fighting Soviets. The home front crumbles. Inside the Soviet Union, Afghanistan became known simply as the war. No other identifier necessary. Unlike previous Soviet military interventions in Hungary, 1956, or Czechoslovakia, 1968, this war couldn't be hidden or quickly forgotten. Casualty figures were classified, but every Soviet family knew someone who had died or been wounded in Afghanistan. Soviet media portrayed the war as internationalist duty, helping the Afghan people build socialism. But soldiers' letters told different stories. Mothers organized protests demanding their sons' return, virtually unprecedented in the Soviet system. Afghan war veterans, called Afghansi, returned home to find themselves unwanted and disturbed, suffering from what we now call PTSD. Many turned to alcohol or drugs. Suicide rates among Afghansi climbed steadily through the 1980s. The economic cost was crushing. The CIA estimated the war cost the Soviet Union $10 billion per year, roughly 3% of Soviet GDP. Military expenditures for Afghanistan diverted resources from the USSR's already struggling civilian economy. Soviet citizens faced worsening shortages, while their government poured money into a war nobody believed could be won. The war reached its peak intensity in 1986-1987, just as Soviet leadership was preparing for withdrawal. The Battle of Khost, the last gasp in November 1987. Soviet forces launched Operation Magistral, their largest offensive of the entire war. The objective: break a mujahideen siege of Khost, a strategic city in southeastern Afghanistan near the Pakistani border. 20,000 Soviet and Afghan government troops, supported by hundreds of aircraft and thousands of artillery pieces, attacked mujahideen positions controlling the road to Khost. The operation was led by Lieutenant General Boris Gromov, one of the Soviet Army's most capable commanders. For 2 months, Soviet forces assaulted fortified mujahideen positions in freezing winter conditions. The mujahideen, now armed with stingers, wire-guided anti-tank missiles, and sophisticated communications equipment, inflicted heavy casualties. Soviet casualties in Operation Magistral reached 1,000 killed and wounded, extraordinary losses for what was supposed to be a war winding down. The operation technically succeeded. The road to Khost was temporarily cleared, but it demonstrated the futility of the entire Afghan venture. Days after Soviet forces withdrew, Mujahideen fighters reoccupied their positions and resumed the siege. Lieutenant Pavel Gruzdev, who fought in Magistral, later wrote, "We took the heights. We killed maybe 500, 1,000 of them. We lost hundreds of our own. And for what? So politicians in Moscow could claim victory before withdrawal? Everyone knew we were leaving. Everyone knew we'd lost." The final accounting. By the time Mikhail Gorbachev announced withdrawal in February 1988, the war's toll was catastrophic. Soviet casualties: 15,051 killed in action, hundreds more dying later from wounds, perhaps 35,000 total dead when counting accidents, disease, and suicides. Another 53,653 wounded, many maimed for life. Hundreds taken prisoner, most never returning. Approximately 620,000 Soviet soldiers served in Afghanistan over 9 years, meaning roughly 1 in 12 never came home intact. Afghan casualties dwarfed Soviet losses. Estimates range from 850,000 to 1.5 million Afghan civilians killed. The Mujahideen lost perhaps 90,000 to 175,000 fighters. The Soviet-backed Afghan government's military suffered approximately 18,000 killed. 1 in 3 Afghans became a refugee. Half the country's villages were damaged or destroyed. The economic devastation was equally complete. Afghanistan's GDP in 1989 was 1/3 its 1979 level. Landmines contaminated thousands of square miles. Estimates suggest 10-15 million mines laid by both sides, making Afghanistan one of the most heavily mined countries on Earth. Agricultural production collapsed. Life expectancy fell. Infant mortality soared. For the Soviet Union, Afghanistan accelerated forces already undermining the communist system. The war cost an estimated $120 billion over 9 years. Resources the struggling Soviet economy couldn't afford. Military prestige, critical for maintaining the USSR's superpower status, was shattered. The Soviet army that limped home from Afghanistan was demoralized, addicted, and angry at the political leadership that had sent them to die for nothing. February 15, 1989. The last Soviet soldier. The withdrawal took 10 months, beginning in May 1988. Soviet forces pulled back in stages, evacuating bases and abandoning Afghan government troops they'd claimed to be defending. The final Soviet unit to leave Afghanistan was the 201st Motor Rifle Division, commanded by General Boris Gromov. On February 15, 1989, Gromov walked across the Friendship Bridge connecting Afghanistan to Soviet Uzbekistan. He was the last Soviet soldier to leave Afghanistan, a symbolic gesture orchestrated for Soviet television. Gromov's son walked beside him. Soviet cameramen filmed the moment for propaganda purposes. The resolute general, mission accomplished, bringing his men home. But the footage captured something else: the exhaustion, the relief, the knowledge of failure. As Gromov reached Soviet soil, he turned back toward Afghanistan and saluted. Asked years later what he thought in that moment, Gromov replied, "I thought of all the boys we left behind in that cursed land. I thought we just lost our empire. I was right." The Soviet-backed Afghan government, expected to collapse immediately, actually survived until 1992. Not because of its legitimacy, but because the mujahideen immediately turned on each other in civil war. President Mohammad Najibullah held Kabul until April 1992, when he was finally overthrown. When the Taliban captured him in 1996, they tortured him to death and hung his body from a traffic pole. The Soviet war in Afghanistan didn't cause the collapse of the USSR, but it accelerated every factor that did. The war drained economic resources the Soviet system couldn't spare, destroyed military prestige that held the empire together, and shattered the mythology of Soviet invincibility that had sustained communist ideology since 1945. Historians debate what would have happened without Afghanistan. Perhaps the Soviet Union would have collapsed anyway from internal contradictions, economic stagnation, technological backwardness, the contradiction between communist ideology and Soviet reality. But Afghanistan ensured the collapse would come sooner and more completely. The war also transformed Soviet society in ways that made reform possible. Returning veterans demanded accountability. Families of the dead demanded truth. The glasnost, openness policies Mikhail Gorbachev implemented after 1985 were partly responses to demands from Afghans and their families for honest accounting of the war's costs. Once the regime admitted lying about Afghanistan, every other Soviet lie became questionable. For Afghanistan, the Soviet withdrawal began a cycle of violence that continues today. The mujahideen victory led to civil war. Civil war led to Taliban rule. Taliban rule led to al-Qaeda finding sanctuary in Afghanistan and planning the September 11, 2001 attacks. American invasion followed, then 20 years of American occupation that ended in 2021 with another superpower withdrawal and another Taliban takeover. The lessons from 1979-1989 should have been clear. Military force cannot impose political solutions on societies that reject them. Mountainous terrain and determined resistance can defeat technological superiority. And intervention in Afghanistan has destroyed every empire that attempted it. Yet America repeated the Soviet experience in Afghanistan, occupying the country for 20 years and withdrawing in circumstances eerily similar to the Soviet departure. Zbigniew Brzezinski, asked years later if he regretted giving the USSR its Vietnam, replied, "What was more important in the worldview of history, the Taliban or the fall of the Soviet Empire? A few stirred-up Muslims or the liberation of Central Europe and the end of the Cold War?" His answer captured the moral complexity of Afghanistan. Perhaps bleeding the Soviets in Afghanistan did help end the Cold War, but the few stirred-up Muslims would eventually attack New York and Washington on September 11, 2001. Back in Tajbeg Palace, where it all began, bullet holes still mark the walls from December 27, 1979. The building, damaged in subsequent decades of fighting, stands as a monument to imperial hubris. The Soviet Union sent its army to secure a neighbor and defend socialism. Instead, they armed and radicalized an Islamic resistance that would haunt the world for decades, destroyed their own military's morale and effectiveness, bankrupted their economy, and accelerated their empire's collapse. Colonel Grigory Boyarinov, who died taking that palace, never imagined that his successful operation would begin a war that would destroy the Soviet Union itself. That's the ultimate lesson of Afghanistan. In war, we rarely see what we've actually started until it's far too late to stop it.